Tommy was pretty lucky to kick a goal with his first kick in AFL football because it was the only goal he kicked. And I can remember Tommy turning up to my daughter Cara's engagement party, and he turned up just in a pair of shorts. No shoes, no top. And my son-in-law said to him, "Aren't you wearing a shirt, Tommy?" He said, "I didn't think it was formal." Now, for those that don't know, Tommy drove a Jeep. Do you know that? He drove a Jeep. He drove a Jeep all over the country. He didn't buy a Jeep. He drove a Jeep. He shot a commercial for Jeep, and the deal was that a new Jeep every 3 months. Jeep figured that a man over 80 would drive to church on a Sunday and to pick up the paper. Jeep figured that after 3 months it would have 1,500 k's on the clock and would be sold as a new car. Jeep didn't figure that after 3 months it would have 84,000 kilometres on the clock and would be sent to the wreckers. Tommy drove a Jeep all right to every football club and netball club in the land. He had some favourite sayings. If you want loyalty, get a dog. That was to all the football committees that sacked him. You'd run faster if chased by a crocodile. That's what he used to say to players when he thought they could run a lot faster than they were out in the field. He'd always answer the question, "How do you like your tea, Tommy?" with hot and strong. If not, I'll send it back, and he did. He's so slow he couldn't catch Humphrey B. Bear. That was a player who just couldn't run. And of course, sensational but getting better was his favourite one. Tommy actually thought getting up at 5:20 in the morning and walking across the road in his Speedos and swimming across Port Phillip Bay and back in icy water and then running 10 k's, followed by 1,000 sit-ups and 1,000 push-ups, was a great way to start a day. He didn't convince me, nor many of his friends. And then, of course, he saw himself as a beach inspector, because then he'd walk along the beach to pick up syringes. His record was 38 in one day. He was really proud of that record. No gloves. Just put him in the towel. His first training session at Richmond as coach was 2 laps of the tan. He said, "Do your best," and off we all went. We never saw him again, except for the several players he lapped. Those he lapped, please put up your hand in this room. The second training session was 10 440s with 60 seconds break in between. And then the third one, this was on the Friday night, we trained Monday, Wednesdays and Fridays. And the third training session was 2200s over, 2200s I should say, with a 60-second rest. Tommy ran them all until he absolutely dropped because he had little chunky legs, and he ran those 400s. And that's where the legend was made. And everyone at the club said, "Well, how good is this?" Because all of a sudden you had this coach who turned up and he's beating everyone around the tan, and then he's beating everyone in the 400s, and then he's beating everyone in the 200s. I mean, it was quite remarkable, and the legend was made. You know, nothing much has changed in football. Tommy's first game as coach of Richmond was against Carlton at Princes Park. And the siren didn't work at the end of the game. So nothing has changed in football. And they couldn't find the cowbell to actually ring. We believe to this very day just a Carlton conspiracy. The game actually continued on, and a policeman on his horse charged out onto the ground to alert the umpire that the game had ended. Richmond fullback was a young man called Billy Walford. I played with him in the under-19s. He was playing fullback that day, just his 4th game of AFL football. Recalls how he had to run around the horse to actually contest the ball. That should have alerted the umpire that the game was over. The Tigers won by 6 points, and of course the Hafey era began. That game was the start of the club's golden era of premiership 67, 69, 73 and 74, when a little club, of course, hadn't played in finals for 24 years, and Tommy took over with a bunch of very experienced players in Roger Dean and Neville Crowe and Mike Patterson and Bull Richardson. Freddie Swift, of course, was there. And a bunch of young kids came up from the under-19s. A lot of us came up, and then he went out and recruited, of course. Royce Hart came across from Tasmania, Barry Richardson from St Pat's College, Michael Green, of course, also in the under-19s, came down from Assumption College. And then in 1967, against a very, very formidable Geelong side, which at that stage had likes of Polly Farmer and Doug Wade and Billy Goggin and Gordon Hines and Kenny Newlands and Sam Newman. I mean, they had a fantastic side. They were a team of champions like they are today. And Richmond, of course, did not have one player who had actually played in any final until that final series. And in that grand final, Richmond won its first grand final in 24 years against Geelong. And then, of course, it carried on in 69, 73 and 74, and Hafey's heroes were born. I had the best seat in the house, of course, at Carlton when he coached his first game because I was 19th man. So in those days, you sat next to the coach. I told him at half-time he didn't have a clue. For I was the greatest rover in the game, and I was on the bench. I was 18 at the time. He ignored me, and the following week he dropped me. Should have kept my mouth shut, I reckon. Most Saturday nights, there was a function at Tommy's and Moore's. It was fantastic. Tommy believed in keeping everyone together. And it was always at Tommy's and Moore's. He'd go out and buy the Kentucky Fried Chicken or the fish and chips. The players could have a drink, and there'd always be a cup of tea on, of course, around the kitchen. He would say, of course, at training on the Thursday night, there's a function at my place. It's not compulsory to attend. He always made that point, not compulsory to attend. But if you didn't, you won't be selected the following week. There was always a rider. And it was always a packed house at Tommy and Moore's. Tommy was proud that every birthday and every 21st engagement and wedding and was a club function. He prided the club on that. That was a club function because that's what he thought football was about, getting the players together and the wives and the girlfriends, getting all the kids there because he felt if you had a happy club, you're going to have a very, very, very good football club. And that's what Richmond was. Tommy shaped our lives. He was a father figure, a mentor, he was an advisor, and he was the conduit that actually joined us all together. Tommy's time at Collingwood was an extraordinary one when you look back at it. Wooden spooners to a grand final draw in 1977 was incredible. I can remember when Tommy rang me up and said he was going to Collingwood. I was so upset and disappointed that he decided to leave Richmond. He rang me and said he was going to resign as coach of the Richmond Football Club, which to me, and I said, well, reconsider because the players love you. And he said, no, I have to move on. So it was with great disappointment when he did. But he took Collingwood from wooden spooners, of course, into that grand final, and Tommy still maintains they would have won that if the great Phil Carman had been able to play after being suspended. I think against North Melbourne, I think he'd kicked 5 goals in both games they played that year. So it was a mighty loss, and they drew that first grand final and lost the second one. Of course, in total, 5 grand finals in his first 5 years, including that drawn grand final, and then he was sacked. We had a lunch date at the Commonwealth cafeteria. We had lunch 3 times a week for 10 years, Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays. Tommy would always drop in and we'd have lunch at the Commonwealth cafeteria because I worked at Telecom. Well, I attended Telecom. I became very good at darts and chess. And so Tommy used to drop in and we'd go up to the Commonwealth cafeteria on the 12th floor, top end of Spring Street. He came to my work on this particular day and I said, how are you going, Tom? And always said sensational but getting better. And he said, but it has been a better day. I said, why is that? He said, I've just been sacked as coach at Collingwood. He was shocked by that because he had a phone call to come down to the club, and when he went down to the club, he expected just to say, keep going. They'd started the season pretty ordinary. Keep going, we're 100% behind you. You've done a mighty job. But he was sacked, and he came to my work, and when he told me that, I said to him, well, let's forget lunch. You've probably got so many things on your mind. He said, don't be crazy. Lamb roast is on the menu today. So we went up to the top of the 12th floor of the Commonwealth building, and there we were sitting down having lamb roast. And I kept thinking to myself, the biggest story in football is about to break. And here's Tommy having lunch at the Commonwealth cafeteria because he had this great ability to just move on, just move on. He didn't believe in rejection at all and was already looking forward to the future. He loved his time down at Geelong, and it was great to see Bruce Nankervis here today. The only person I've ever got reported for striking in AFL football. So it was great to see Bruce. It was an accidental king hit too, Bruce. I'm sorry about that. But he did love his time down at Geelong by the sea. In his first game as coach of the Cats, Gary Ablett Sr. played his first game for the Cats on a wing and booted 4 goals. Everyone's entitled to an off day, even Gazza. In the centre, playing his first game, was Greg Williams. Greg Williams had written a letter to Tommy asking him to give him a chance. He'd been rejected by Carlton, and he'd been a great player up in Bendigo, but for some reason he wrote this letter to Tommy saying that he was slow, he was small, probably had attributes that some people didn't like, but he said he could win the ball a lot, he could pass it off, he'd like to be a team person, and he liked to bring other people into the game. And he begged Tommy for a chance, and that's how he got down to Geelong. Tommy answered the letter, got him down there, and Greg Williams lined up in the centre in that very first game Tommy coached down at Geelong. And on the other wing, of course, was the great Michael Turner. Not a bad centre line. Ablett, Williams and Turner. Second only to, you know who. Burke, Barrett and Clay. In Sydney, he did great things, Tommy, in Sydney. I don't think he quite gets the recognition that he deserves in shaping the national game. He became coach in 1986. He was a great admirer of Jeff Edelson. I know he has a lot of critics, but Tommy said he was absolutely fantastic in the way that he helped generate interest up there in Sydney. And with a group of players that went up there, Greg Williams followed Tommy up to Sydney, Gerard Healy, Bernard Toohey were some of the guys that went up there. Jeffrey Edelson, always Tommy speaks so highly of. He became coach in '86 after the Swans had finished 10th the previous year in a 12-team competition. Not easy up in Sydney then, as you know, not even easy today. In his first year, he had Sydney rocking and rolling and finished second after the home and away season, which is not a bad effort. Second on top of the ladder. He drew crowds of 40,000 to the Sydney Cricket Ground. Can you believe that? In 1986, 40,000 people to the Sydney Cricket Ground to see Sydney Swans play Hawthorn. And 38,000 turned up to the SCG when they played Carlton. These are massive figures. This is in the mid-1980s. Could you imagine, even today, those figures would stand up and people would be thrilled. In 1987, the Swans in round 16 in 1987 versus West Coast, Sydney kicked 30 goals, 21 in round 16. In round 17, the next week, versus Essendon, his team kicked 36 goals, 20. And in round 18, the very next week, against Richmond, they booted 31 goals, 12. So 30 goals, 36 goals and 31 goals, 12. He had Sydney rocking. What a way to play football. 3 weeks of football, the likes we've never seen before or since, was when Tommy, of course, was coaching the Sydney Swans. The following year, the Swans finished 7th. Now, that today gets you into the finals. Back then, it got you the sack. In fact, today, if you finish 7th, you might get a 3-year contract extension. Since then, of course, he devoted his life. He's inspired and motivated children and young adults around the country and those in industry. Tommy started that when he was down at Geelong because there was no full-time coaching in those days. So what he did was to fill in his time, and he thought it'd be great for the Geelong Football Club to get out there and promote the club, that he would travel around all the schools in Geelong and talk to all the kids, as the family has mentioned. He loved that. It was fantastic, and you heard those great stories. But he wanted to do that. One, you could follow Geelong, and two, he thought it'd be great to educate the kids on living a good life. Tommy related stories, of course, of AFL players to everyone at every talk, every speech he made, because he didn't believe in rejection at all. It was just to motivate you to actually go on to bigger and better things. He related stories of AFL players being cut from their clubs and then went to other clubs to win Best and Fairest awards, Brownlow medals, win premierships, become All-Australians and captain their clubs. He had a list as long as his arm that he could give us some demonstration to kids to say, if you get knocked back, don't worry about it. Pick yourself up, dust yourself down, because I've just told you of all these guys who've gone on and done great things. And he loved telling also about cricketers who left their state, batsmen and bowlers and wicketkeepers who went to another state and then, of course, went on to play for Australia in Test cricket. He loved that. He loved those stories because he felt they were uplifting. Tommy, of course, lived in Canberra for a period of time, as we know, and played rugby league up there as a young boy. And then when he went to Sydney, he really embraced rugby league, and he got a lot of the rugby people around to take training and also for tackling. And that was one of the strengths of all Tommy's sides, was tackling. He only had one player that never tackled. That was me. But it was impossible for me to tackle because I had the ball all the time. So. But he used to get him in for the other players. And he did that up in Sydney, and the idea was to make him the strongest tackling team in the business. So he loved rugby league, he loved it. He loved Australian rules football, it was always number one, but he loved the toughness of people in rugby league. He loved the way that they went about it, he loved their character. Just recently I was visiting Tommy in hospital, and Craig Bellamy was there, and who's coach, of course, of Melbourne Storm. He loved Melbourne Storm. What a fan he was of Storm. And CEO Frank Panisi was there as well. Great friends of Tommy, and they'd come in to see Tommy. And Tommy was in bed, and I just thought I'd wind him up a little bit by saying to Craig Bellamy and in the company of Frank Panisi as well, I said, "How do you rate Billy Slater, Tommy?" And he went, Billy Slater would win the Brownlow medal in his first year of AFL footy. He could open the bowling for Australia. He could beat Usain Bolt at the Olympic Games. And he could ride the winner of the Melbourne Cup. I think it's fair to say he had a high opinion of Billy Slater. Tommy loved setting himself goals, and we heard the girls talk about this before, you know, silly ones. I used to say to him, "You're crazy, you're silly. Why won't you have a cake or a biscuit?" Because 45 years ago on a New Year's Eve resolution, he got up and said, "I'm not going to eat cake and biscuit anymore." I mean, how stupid is that? Then he decided he wasn't going to eat sweets. For the last 35 years, he hasn't even eaten a sweet. And, of course, we heard the girls talking about it. He told me, he said, he rang up the start of this year. In fact, I had New Year's Eve with him, and he said, "You know, I'm going to read 20 books this year. 20 books. That's my goal. 20 books. Always, you know, sporting books, of course, nothing too heavy. Always about, you know, sport and people who've done great things." He said, "I'm going to try 10 new restaurants this year." That was another thing he wanted to do. Always had to go to 10 new restaurants. Didn't mean he didn't go to the old ones. He did eat mainly at Dimartina's, I must say that. Frankie was always very kind with the bill. And then, of course, he had to go to 5 concerts, 5 new concerts a year. That was important to him. 5 new concerts. Had to go and watch people sing, and loved it when it was down at the Palais there, and they had the local Go show was on there recently, and back to, you know, the rocking and rolling from 45 years ago. His great mate Danny Finlay was there, of course, with MPD, Mike, Peter and Danny, and managed Tommy for so many years and did a marvellous, marvellous job when Tommy was, you know, at Collingwood and when he was at Sydney and at Geelong, and he was a lifelong friend. And Danny, of course, was a famous drummer in Mike, Peter and Danny, MPD, Little Boy Blue, Little Boy Sad. I may even sing a few bars if I keep going. But he loved to go to concerts. He loved music, and we heard it before, his beautiful granddaughter Sam singing a marvellous song. And, of course, the other thing he loved to do was ring everyone in Australia. That's what he loved. No matter where he went around the country, for some reason, Tommy had this memory where he knew where every former player lived, every former player resided. So if he was giving a talk somewhere, he'd go 50 k's out of his way, because he'd knock on someone's door and he'd say, "Oh, you won't believe who I saw the other day." And then away he would go. He would do silly things, in actual fact. He would do things like, he was a workaholic. He did love talking to people all the time. He had to meet people. He had to be there in their company. He'd go to Mildura, and I'd say, "What are you doing this weekend, Tommy?" So, "I'm going to Mildura." And I'd say, "That's great, on the Monday." And then I've got to get up very early Tuesday morning, because I've got to drive to Shepparton for a dinner, a luncheon there at Shepparton. I said, "Oh, well, that's a fair way, Tommy, you know." "Oh, no, it should be right." So, and then I'd say, "Well, what's then, home?" "No, I've got a function on in Mildura." I used to say, "Tommy, if you're in Mildura and you've got to drive all the way to Shepparton, I mean, it's a bit difficult to go all the way back to Mildura, isn't it?" No, she's fine." Of course, he was a shocking driver, as everyone knows. A shocking driver. He got pulled up once out the front of Punt Road. Got pulled up by he was sitting at the lights. Tommy drove very, very fast, by the way. Very fast. He was sitting at the lights, and he was looking in his rear vision mirror, and he was very late for a speaking engagement. And he was at the lights, waiting for the lights to change, and then he took off. He knew the police car was behind him. The police car very quickly put on their siren and pulled him over. And Tommy was in a hurry. So the police pulled over. And as you know, when they pull you over, they sit in their car for a short period of time. Tommy was pulled over in his car. But unlike most people who sit in their car, he jumped out of his car. He ran back and he said, I'm in a hurry. What's going on? And they said, well, you're travelling too fast. He said, that is rubbish. He said, I saw you in my rear vision mirror. He said, I'm not going to take off and break the speed limit when I can see you in my rear vision mirror. He said, that's rubbish. The bloke said, well, we clocked you at doing 75 Ks. And Tommy said, check it out, it's wrong. Ran back, jumped in his car and took off. I said to Tommy, what did they do? He said, they just sat there in amazement. Just took off. Tonight, on behalf of Tommy, I'd say go home, do 5 push-ups, have 5 sit-ups, go for a walk or go for a jog and say sensational but getting better, and always remember Tommy drove a Jeep.